and thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Michael Verbora, and I want to just thank everybody for taking their time out of a very busy 2020, and thanks for joining us. And I hope that you walk away after tonight's discussion and education session with some knowledge, probably more questions, and I guess we can just get the party started. So I'm going to share my screen with you, walk you through a little bit about Field Trip Health, who is putting on this webinar, and then introduce you to my co-host tonight. So today we're going to talk about psychedelic therapy and talk about coping and healing. So who is Field Trip Health? Well, Field Trip Health is really a mental wellness company. And we understand that the vast majority of us at some point suffer mental injury or mental illness. And for some people, traditional options may be all that is required to help individuals heal and live a better life. But we also realize that there are fundamentally other opportunities or medicines when combined with therapy that might help a majority of people who don't receive benefit from traditional options. And so we want to take that science, we want to take that knowledge, we want to enhance that science and knowledge, and we want to offer it to people. What do we do currently? So our business is ever evolving, but today there's only one legal psychedelic that you can use, and that is ketamine. And ketamine is quite an old drug, and we'll spend some time talking about it. But what we do is we offer ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and we typically treat some of the most difficult to treat resistant mental health cases, particularly depression, but also anxiety, and maybe even post-traumatic stress disorder. Our clinics don't look like your traditional clinics. We do believe that the future of mental health care is the combination of drugs with therapy together to rapidly change an individual's circumstances, to really ultimately enable them to be their own healers. Our clinic, our flagship clinic, is in Toronto on Duncan Street. Feel free to reach out to us and come by for a visit to take a look. And we do plan on launching a number of clinics by the end of the year. So that's just a little bit about Field Trip Health. And I want to more formally introduce myself and then let my co-hosts today introduce themselves. So I'm Dr. Michael Verbora. I'm a family doctor by training, and I'm the medical director at Field Trip Health. And I think it's important that I share how I got to this point today and why I'm here. I graduated at a time in medicine where the opioid crisis was really at its peak and was a big conversation in medicine. And there was this pressure to do something different, but nobody knew what to do. And I took it upon myself, graduating, that I investigate some of these alternative therapies and drugs, and I stumbled across cannabis. And I learned that it was substantially safer than opioids. I learned that it was extremely therapeutic and that there was no toxicity. And when used properly, it really did help thousands of my individual patients reduce or their other pharmaceuticals which were causing problems. One thing led to another, and after a number of years working with cannabis, I started to become educated on psilocybin, ketamine, and these other psychedelic drugs, and realized that there was an extension into mental health with psychedelics. And after reading Michael Pollan's book, which I'll talk about today, that was really a stimulus for me to get involved and to contribute my expertise and my knowledge, and to try to provide a safe space for patients to have a discussion about psychedelics and contribute to the science. So that's why I'm here today. I believe in providing new therapies for patients, particularly those who cannot get benefit from traditional therapies, and contributing to the science. So I'm going to pause, and I'm going to let Dr. Joseph DeLeo introduce himself.
Clinical psychologist, and recently re-specialized in rehabilitation psychology. I'm also acting director of clinical therapy at Field Trip. And my fascination with substances spans quite a long time. So I'll give a very brief run through of kind of what's brought me to this place in time. Part of it actually has a similar genesis to what Dr. Verbora was sharing. I was acutely aware of the impact of the opiate epidemic in the early 2000s and had the privilege of doing some research at CAMH, and initially saw street drug users using various substances to try to cope with the challenges of daily living. And what came to light was cannabis was constantly brought up as a way to help mitigate some of the negative side effects of using opiates. And it kind of broadened my perspective, which at that point was fairly myopic and had only focused on, say, the harms associated with substance use. And it occurred to me that there were several in my own circle, my family members, that were managing complex conditions. And I thought that cannabis on compassionate grounds might actually be a better alternative to some of the treatments they had been exposed to. So that essentially prompted my interest in pursuing that academically. Went to a school, graduate school, and focused my studies primarily in substance use, but also quickly learned that if we're going to focus on substance use, there's a whole bunch that comes with that, and namely often trauma and life adversity. So over the course of many years, I've spent time focusing on addictions, trauma, and now chronic pain issues. And it kind of puts me smack dab in the middle of really needing better tools. I've also had the very fortunate privilege of having personal experiences with some of these medicines that were profound. And I think part of my academic experiences and privileges offered me an opportunity to share kind of my own journey. And it's something that I think, as we've discussed, is kind of hard to keep to yourself when you've been impacted in such a profound way. So it's a wonderful privilege to be here together with Daniel Carcillo and Dr. Verbora to be able to share these experiences more broadly and also share about what we're doing at Field Trip. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. DeLeo. We're also very fortunate today to have Daniel Carcillo, a two-time Stanley Cup winner and a very big advocate for plant medicine, who has a very inspirational story, which we're very fortunate and blessed that he's going to share with us today. So I'll let Daniel introduce himself a bit better than I can.
How you guys doing? Thank you for having me, Daniel Carcillo. Yes, I in my past life, I won 2 Stanley Cups, and also right now, currently, just a really big concussion awareness, mental health advocate. Turned in the last year after recovering my brain health using traditional psychedelic therapies, plant medicine and entheogenic plant and fungi advocate. It's when I retired in 2015, it was difficult to operate. It was difficult to have 3 really young children and suffer from the post-concussive syndromes and symptoms like light sensitivity and slurred speech, long-term memory loss, concentration issues. So just really blessed to for this past year. It was just my year anniversary a couple days ago. And really happy to be sitting here today with better relationships and free from anxiety and depression, and operating on a really high level and just creating and trying to advocate my best for these plant medicines, and really excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Gonna get back to our slideshow now. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through a little bit about the history of psychedelics, and very much so like the history of cannabis, it has a very interesting narrative or story, and we're really at a very profound time. So first we need to understand what is a psychedelic and what does even the word psychedelic mean. So we should define that. So we can break this word up into psyche and delusion. And what it really means is mind or soul manifesting or revealing. When people have a psychedelic experience, they get a super intense sensory perception. They get this unfiltered data that doesn't have to go through the typical filters of our brain that we establish after years and years of programming. And predominantly, the experiences are typically euphoric. And they can reveal a lot of common sense things that maybe we lost our intuition about being so common. And that feels very familiar to you when you have that experience. Not all experiences are necessarily euphoric, and some can be very difficult, very emotional experiences. But the saying in the psychedelic community is that there's no such thing as a bad experience, and that each of them has their own message. The history of these drugs is extremely complex. They go back hundreds and hundreds of years with complicated ceremonial, religious, sacramental, spiritual connections, and also, very complicated politics as they began to slowly enter mainstream. So drugs like peyote are, typically used in the indigenous communities. Ayahuasca is in mostly South America, where the combination of two plants produces a very, eye-opening experience through a chemical called DMT. LSD is a synthetically designed drug in the 1930s, which has immense research, which we'll talk about. MDMA, many people know that as the ecstasy or the club drug. However, today, the research going on with MDMA and PTSD is potentially groundbreaking. Psilocybin is a very exciting molecule. We have extensive use with psilocybin, and it may be an ingredient that actually contributed to some of the changes in the ape brain into evolving into the human brain. There's a lot of theories out there that these drugs, which stimulate new nerve cells from generating, helped society move forward, and essentially were involved in our evolution. So if I can take you back about 50, 60, 70 years ago, there was a synthetically designed drug called LSD. There's a beautiful story of the chemist who designed it, a Swiss chemist who accidentally ingested it and then had a very psychedelic experience or a bike ride. And he realized that despite his effort to make this as a stimulating drug, it actually was probably more an antidepressive, more anti-anxiety type of medication. And then it slowly made its way from the laboratory into the hands of clinicians and scientists. And it was studied extensively. There's over 1,000 scientific papers in that decade that were published on LSD. And the conclusions were relatively the same, that it was effective and that it was extremely safe. There was no deaths, there was no toxicity. And when used in a setting, typically with eye shades, music, and in a supportive psychotherapy, people had profound experiences that were very therapeutic for them. Now, I think the problem was with time, these drugs slowly made their way into the culture of the fabric of culture, which was probably beautiful. I wasn't unfortunately around at the time, but unfortunately, they probably left the lab a little bit too quick, and people started to take them en masse. And it was probably disrupting a lot of the status quo, and particularly these drugs contributed to anti-war movements and more peaceful protests and all sorts of anti-establishment. And there was this, fight. And ironically, we're here in 2020 and we're still fighting some of these fights today. And unfortunately, the powers that be had the authority to suppress and stop these drugs. So despite the science clearly showing that drugs like LSD were relatively safe and extremely therapeutic, governments like the US went on to label these drugs as class 1 drugs. And once you label a drug as a class 1 drug, you almost immediately make it impossible to study. And it officially becomes defined as a drug with no therapeutic potential and only harms, which is completely inaccurate. And cannabis today actually is still a Schedule 1 drug, right? Despite us knowing that it helps with epilepsy and chronic pain, for example. So the politics, unfortunately, really suppressed our ability to study these drugs, which suppressed the entire movement. Nonetheless, we're here in 2020, and there's this renaissance taking place, and there's people having conversations, and companies that have been involved with research on psychedelics for decades are nearing the end of stage 2 and stage 3 trials, which is bringing a lot of these psychedelic drugs very close to the market for consumption in a safe clinical setting to help people with a whole host of medical conditions. The book in the middle is How to Change Your Mind. It's not too old now, maybe a year or two. And that book was very inspirational to me to really change my perspective as a clinician, because I can tell you, going through medical school, there was nothing positive that I ever learned about psychedelic therapies. Very little was contributed in my entire exhaustive medical degree about psychedelics or even other substances. And then Netflix, that's as mainstream as it gets these days, has documentaries as well as, shows surrounded by psychedelics. And so these are some of the common themes that we're seeing today. So let's walk through some of these psychedelic substances just to make sure we have a little bit of an understanding on these different drugs. So psychedelics are also known as what we call empathogens, okay, enhancing empathy. Psychotomimemic, not the best word, enhancing psychosis, and entheogen. So LSD is a synthetic psychedelic, and its effects can last, as long as 12 hours. Lots of science out there showing that it's not an addictive substance, and at some point, 10% of people in the US have tried LSD. DMT is a really fascinating molecule. Some people call it the spirit molecule. There's some evidence to suggest that, when we have near-death experiences, our bodies secrete these molecules so they can be made in the human body. But it actually naturally occurs in different plants as well. And in the Amazon, a lot of these cultures combine two different plants to make DMT active in the body when ingested. And it produces a very, very profound psychedelic experience. So it's predominantly used more in a spiritual sense and ceremonial sense today. Psilocybin is the natural occurring psychedelic ingredient in what we call magic mushrooms. It does convert to psilocin in the body, so this is what we call a prodrug. It can last 4 to 6 hours or even longer. Historically, it's been used for healing and spirituality, and it's probably one of the most researched psychedelic drugs today, particularly natural one. MDMA is a synthetic drug. I won't try to pronounce its name because it's quite long. We call this, common folk will call it ecstasy. It's typically involved in the rave culture, at least historically. Its effects are extremely heart-opening and empathogenic, and it's probably the leading and single best candidate for post-traumatic stress disorder. And there are a number of institutions now listed there that are studying these drugs in very typical pharmaceutical-like fashion. THC, that's actually a psychedelic as well. So THC is found in the cannabis plant. It binds to cannabinoid receptors in the human brain. But take enough THC and you can experience a mild psychedelic experience, and that can be extremely therapeutic. Taking a holiday from your normal thoughts seems to be the therapeutic mechanism by which these psychedelics work. THC is responsible for regulating a lot of the homeostasis that takes place in our body. Mescaline is another one found in cacti. And it's, spiritually, they call it the divine messenger, and indigenous communities around the world are known to use this and have an extensive history. And then ketamine is really, the predominant molecule that we're seeing being used today. And it's quite remarkable because of its wide range of use. Different doses of ketamine really produce different effects. This is a synthetic drug designed in the 1960s. And during the Vietnam War, it was called a buddy drug because, everybody carried it on them. And if the guy next to you went down, you would just give them an injection of ketamine to suppress pain without suppressing their ability to breathe. At certain doses, lower doses and high doses, but it does cause dissociative effects. So you dissociate from your normal pattern of thought. But we use it every single day in the emergency room. So children who suffer fractures or injuries will go to the emergency room. They'll get a big dose of ketamine. That'll put them in an anesthetic state where they can reset the bone, and they come out and they're completely normal. So we have extensive history and science and knowledge of using this. It's a very safe drug. And what's really remarkable, it's only in the last 10 to 15 years we've started to learn that ketamine is the only drug, to my knowledge, that's available for use today that is a rapid-acting antidepressant. So all of the antidepressants that are currently on the market, excuse me, take a minimum of 6 weeks to kick in. And none of these drugs are actually approved, these pharmaceutical drugs are approved for acute suicidal ideation because they take 6 weeks to kick in. Ketamine, to my knowledge, is the only medication that has acute suicidal benefits. So it can rapidly change an individual's suicidal thoughts, which is pretty remarkable. Ketamine, when you take it intramuscularly or by lozenge, typically lasts about 45 minutes to an hour. And we're now using this, at least at Field Trip Health, in lozenge form with our psychotherapy to really help people who have mental health disorders that have not responded to other conditions. One other really interesting point about ketamine, if you recall a couple of years ago now, there was that Thai cave rescue and a number of boys, I believe on a sports team, were trapped with their coaches in a cave. To help them get out of the cave and to go underwater without panicking, which would have created a horrible outcome, they gave all of these children ketamine. So it just allowed them to dissociate. It did not change their ability to breathe, and it allowed them to be not have extreme anxiety during, which was a very anxiety-provoking moment. Now, what is the scientific evidence on the risks of these drugs? So, I recall in the back of my mind advertisements of, a cracked egg on a frying pan saying, if you take drugs, this is what your brain looks like. And that was a message that somehow penetrated to me at a young age. But if you look at the science, and this is really a fascinating study. What we know is that the psychedelic drugs are actually the safest drugs available compared to what we typically call, recreational drugs or pharmaceuticals. So drugs like alcohol, heroin, tobacco are some of the worst and most harmful substances for individuals. And it's not only the individual who's harmed when they use alcohol, but it's, the wife who suffers domestic abuse when their partner uses alcohol, or, the family who gets hit by a drunk driver who kills them. Alcohol doesn't just harm the individual who uses it, but it harms so many other people. And when you combine those two, which is what this study did from Dr. Nutt in the UK, you combine those two different areas of harm, and you can see that alcohol profoundly destroys every other drug out there with respect to harm. Yet this is a legal substance that you're allowed to consume at any will. Nonetheless, if you look at drugs like ketamine, ecstasy, MDMA, LSD, and mushrooms, you can see that they're way at the bottom of this list. They do not produce the harms that other substances do. They're actually very safe substances, especially when used properly. So where are we today? What really inspires me is there's nothing more inspirational when my inbox gets flooded with a new study that comes out on a psychedelic drug or a plant medicine that totally changes the game. And I'm seeing this, on a quarterly or, biannual basis now, where I'm getting a paper in my inbox showing that a single dose of psilocybin might produce 5 years of benefits. And to me, that is profoundly different. To be able to give my patient a single experience and to know that they might be potentially good for 5 years is remarkable. Because today the option is to give them a pill every single day for 5 years with a high probability that it stops working and a high probability that they get a lot of side effects that prevents them from continuing using it. So I'm extremely optimistic because the data thus far looks exceptional. When you look at ketamine, we have good evidence for depression and suicidality. Those are the two main areas of evidence, but we're looking now at post-traumatic stress, end-of-life anxiety and depression, and dependence and addiction disorders. When you look at psilocybin, depression, OCD, end-of-life anxiety and depression, there's actually a lot of emerging phase 2 and phase 3 evidence studies showing that the effects are profound. And if I skip to the bottom of that list, an area that's really interesting to me is eating disorders. We don't have any treatments for eating disorders. And unfortunately, we only have, a couple of different ways that these antidepressants work. We have, hundreds of different antidepressant drugs or antipsychotic drugs, but we throw them at all these mental health conditions hoping that they help. We don't have anything that really has good science for eating disorders. So if we can find something that can help patients, that would be remarkable. And the same goes with MDMA. For post-traumatic stress disorder, there are some therapies that can be very helpful, but a lot of the pharmaceuticals out there do not have exceptionally good science to support them for the use of post-traumatic stress disorder. So MDMA is probably the most promising candidate for post-traumatic stress disorder. And a lot of mental illness that people suffer from comes from some type of trauma, some of which we may remember and some of which we may not remember. And these psychedelic drugs sometimes bring them to the surface and give us an opportunity to revisit them and reprogram our brain in a healthier fashion from that trauma. So what is psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy? Well, I don't need to tell you today that, we're at a very complicated point in time and what feels like to me an inflection point in society and potentially paradigm shifts into how we move forward. And there's so many issues going on simultaneously, and there's a lot of noise that is hard to keep track of. But it really boils down to connection and disconnection. And for me, I'm optimistic that the future is going to allow us to be a lot more fundamentally connected, not just with each other, which is necessary, but connected to nature, connected through empathy, and understanding that we have a pool of limited resources. So for me, these psychedelic drugs and the renaissance of these psychedelic drugs are coming at a time where not only are individuals dealing with individual mental illness, but society is dealing with societal problems that don't necessarily fall under the medical paradigm. So there's no diagnosis for society right now that I can put on, but I have this strong belief that some of these psychedelics are really going to not just cure individuals, but cure some of society's problems. And that's the optimist in me. And we're going to have to wait and see what happens. But I strongly believe in that. So we're at this paradigm shift when it comes to mental health, and there's two perspectives. There's this old notion, right? The biomedical perspective, which is you're going to take this drug is going to alter chemicals in your body. The chemical changes are going to make you better. It's an extremely passive approach. It puts the responsibility onto the drug, and people can say, oh, I took the drug and it didn't work for me. It's also extremely paternalistic, and it's very prescriptive. The alternative is really a biopsychosocial spiritual approach, where it's here is a drug, and the use of that drug is going to give you a window of neuroplasticity or a window of opportunity. And when combined with therapy, give you rapid access to reprogramming the narrative that you tell yourself, reprogramming the lens that which you look at yourself and the world. And that is extremely powerful. But you're not going to have profound mental health changes in individuals or society at large without a profound experience. Think that you can take a pharmaceutical without having psychoactive effects and somehow fundamentally shift people. And I just don't believe in that. It just doesn't make sense to me that you're going to radically shift someone from feeling years and years of depression or trauma overnight through a pharmaceutical unless you have a fundamental psychoactive experience, what we call a psychedelic experience, and you combine it with therapy to help them take that experience and integrate it into their life. So this is the future, and the medical community is a little bit split, but I can tell you the up and coming psychiatrists of the world are shifting their energy, focus, and beliefs into this biopsychosocial spiritual approach and using psychedelic therapies. So what is the problem today that we're trying to help solve? The biggest problem is that depression affects almost everybody at some point. And it's a huge burden on individuals and society. And some medications work slightly better than placebo based on the science. But for many people, the first drug doesn't work, the second drug doesn't work, And as you continue to go on your third or fourth antidepressant, the probability that you find a drug that's going to help you decreases. And there is a huge percentage of people that have what we call treatment-resistant depression, that despite one or two or three pharmaceuticals, they do not have resolution of their symptoms of depression. So when we look at healthcare, we look at not just that biological, that serotonin or dopamine or whatever chemical it is that we can augment, but we really have to understand that for individuals to get better, it's that psychological, social, spiritual connection. And that's what we try to bring to the forefront with every single one of our patients or clients, is trying to understand these moving pieces that contribute to well-being. And we welcome these sometimes difficult conversations. So when you have psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, there's a couple of things you need to consider. One is the drug and how to administer it, the frequency. And this is where our expertise is, given our experience with patients, but also understanding the literature. The second component is the mindset. So not everybody is ready to take a substance that's radically going to change the way they think. So you have to be prepared for not just changes individually, but changes around your life. And you need support, and you need the right actors in your life to help you succeed. So getting that mindset is so crucial. And that's why we have a program that really spends time to understand, are patients ready for the journey that they're about to take? And then the environment is very fundamentally important to the outcome. So you can't take ketamine and go to a rave and expect you're going to have be cured of your depression. How you do it in the right setting, the environment, is probably equally as important for the outcomes. So this is what our setting looks like. This is not your traditional clinical setting, and that's intentional because we know we want to provide people with a different experience. They want to walk in and feel like they're in a different space, which is going to promote, excuse me, or prime the brain for change. So what does the science show? So I'm only going to highlight two really brief studies. I don't want to get into all the details. There are so many different studies we can talk about. But by and large, the results thus far are extremely reassuring, extremely promising, and radical with respect to the outcomes that they're showing. So this graph on the left is a study done in the UK. And the higher that bar graph, the worse the depression is. So a 20 score is pretty severe depression. And this is what these patients had when they entered this study for psilocybin. And they were given 2 doses of psilocybin, like a medium and a higher dose, and they had psychedelic experiences. And what we found is, what these authors found is that almost rapidly, a week later, their depression was essentially cured. They met the criteria for remission, and that was sustained for up to 3 months. And then when you look at ketamine, there was a placebo-controlled trial, and the ketamine dosing is a little bit different in this study. It was 2 doses over 3 weeks, 2 doses over 3 weeks. So sorry, 2, 2, and 2, 6 doses total. And what they found compared to placebo is that there was significant changes in depression scores as well. And the onset was also rapid. So we're dealing with very potent drugs when combined with therapy to really help shift people dramatically. And so how does the process work for a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy? Well, it starts with psychiatric consultation at our clinic to assess if patients qualify from a psychiatric perspective. We also go through a medical evaluation as well as a psychological evaluation to make sure that patients are ready for this. We go through preparatory sessions, and then we begin treatments. And that's typically 1 ketamine dose twice a week combined with therapy. And then after those 2 sessions, you get a once-a-week integration session where we try to understand each individual's unique experience and what that means for them and how can they integrate it into their life so that they can take the messages or the learning and lead a better life. So that's really all I have to share with you from my perspective. And I'm going to hand it over to Daniel Carcillo to share a little bit about his journey.
Brother, that was great. Really great. Good stuff. So I retired in 2015 after a 12-year professional hockey career. and I was suffering a pretty big symptoms, dealing with post symptoms like light sensitivity, slurred speech, short-term, long-term memory loss, the concentration issues, the impulse control issues, and just really, it was, my quality of life was really going downhill. I had a young child and a young wife, and to be honest, I just couldn't be around the loud noises, and I was just so far into my own head to try to figure out what was going on. So I spent the next 4 years just studying papers and reading about concussion and different supplementation and different types of modalities like functional neurology and moxa acupuncture. I got into some self-deprivation tanks, some neurofeedback, but 4 years and a lot of money spent. I took a QEEG. I like to track my progress, and that's a brain scan for anybody listening that doesn't know what it is. It basically measures the different parts of your brain and how they're communicating and functioning. And that was at May 15th last year, and it wasn't good. So I'd spent all this money. I was still suffering from a lot of these symptoms. The anxiety and the depression was getting worse. And then after that test, this hopelessness set in. And I started having suicidal thoughts because I was in a really dark place. And I was starting to feel like I was a burden to my wife, I then had three young children under the age of 5. And I just felt like, I didn't want to show my kids that was like the way to act and grow up. And I was kind of losing control of it all. And so eventually, started to make these plans. And I was saved by a visit to a farm on June 1st. And there I learned about CBD genetics, and I also took it was kind of a surprise, a hero dose of psilocybin. And what it did for me was remarkable. A little bit about the trip. It was a difficult trip. There was a lot of I was kind of lost in life. And so what this medicine tends to do when I have used it in a responsible setting, it shows me exactly what's going on in my life and what's wrong. And I kind of have to work through that. And so I was on this, farm. I was lost. And for about, 90 minutes to 2 hours, I just had to work through, try to understand. And once I surrendered to the medicine, then kind of lied down, and I had a really good guide, and woke up the next day and I felt different. Can't really, put my finger on it, especially back then, until I started really delving into the research and what it does as far as neuroplasticity goes and neuroregeneration. And it's funny because that's what I kept hearing at the clinics, at the functional neurology clinics. We're going to create these new pathways for you, and you're going to be better. And it would work for a month or two, but it definitely didn't do anything for my self-narrative and for my past trauma that I'd received, both physical, emotional, and sexual, coming up in hockey. And so I started delving in because I felt really good. And I went home. I started farming. That was really great for me. I always want to emphasize that this is just one tool in my life that I've used. I also intermittent fast, and I changed my diet. I stay away from alcohol. And I watch my refined white sugar intake as well. For brain injury survivors, it's really important for everyone, really. So I started farming these CBD genetics last year, and the funniest thing happened. And one of the biggest things, and that's when I really started to see the shift. It was about at the 2.5 month mark, and I drove out to my plants. They were about 2 feet tall, and I remember looking at them and thinking, "Wow, really good job. You've never done this before." And I was like, what the heck was that? Because I never motivated myself that way. I never spoke to myself that way. It was always negative, and it was always super hypercritical. And so after that, then I was like, wow, okay, something's really going on here. And I started to, love myself a little bit more. I started to want to be around my kids. It was much more patient. My impulse control issues were gone. I started to mend the relationship with my wife and with my, parents back home, and just with everybody that saw me go through these 4 years,
Yeah.
which is really, really difficult stuff. And it's been a year. I just passed a year, and just everything keeps getting better. There's post-traumatic stress disorder and there's post-traumatic growth, if I can quote Mike Hart.
Absolutely.
And it's everything in my life has changed, and so I took confirm how I felt, and I got it back for the first time with no abnormalities. So it was a pretty great confirmation, because anecdotal stories are great, but I like to kind of track it. I also tracked my blood work. And so now I sit on the National Board of Decriminalized Nature, and I brought the resolution forward to the city of Chicago. And I'm just a really big advocate for get to a point like I was with anxiety and depression and those symptoms. I think it should be, I think people need to know about this, that it's an option. And so I'm a big plant medicine and fungi advocate. And I've experienced a couple of the other plants that you presented. And I think that they are all just amazing healing tools as far as neurogenesis goes. I'm really, really happy to be here. And I really appreciate, people like yourselves and Field Trip for giving access. I spoke in February in Trenton to veterans, and they were all just asking, different types of questions about, different can I get off my SSRIs and all these antidepressants. And so I think that you guys opening your doors and giving them an option, I think is really amazing.
Wow. There's a lot there, right? I do want to at least just reflect back that it's been a privilege and an honor in some sense to have the chance to hear your story. It's remarkable, and it's a common one. I'm sure you know this. We all suffer, and there's no shortage of that these days. I think we're all feeling this acutely amidst the global pandemic, biological pandemic, and certainly a sociological pandemic with respect to racism and the impact on certain communities of color and just historically the broader Indigenous communities in Canada and abroad. So suffering is a common experience for us. And I think what struck me about some of what I've learned about you, Daniel, over the last several weeks is that you've had a remarkable career, enough that you referred to it as a past life. Right? A past life that I think some might be really curious about and so on, but it came at a cost, a tremendous cost. And I recall at one point you saying in one of your public speakings that you were prepared for all of the kind of physicality that comes with being an NHL player. I mean, in fact, I think you listed off, more medical issues than I could recall at this moment in time. But the one thing you said that you weren't prepared for was the psychological impact, the impact to your individual self, and the self that obviously occupies very important role functions as a father, as a family member, and so on, that the concussions had impacted you. So I was wondering if you could just speak a bit more to that. I mean, having lived many lives, let's just say, and now a mental health champion in many respects, that I certainly see you as, letting your story be known, letting others hear your story so that they can connect and resonate with the commonalities of it, how life can change so drastically. We talk a lot about the psychedelic drug, but no doubt you've put some work in. So I just want to make sure that we don't make too many attributions about the drug itself and actually make some room for the humanistic elements of this as well. So perhaps you can speak to some of the ways in which the substance itself opened you up to new experiences that might be aligned with kind of what Dr. Verbora was talking about as far as peak experiences or very impactful or profound experiences that set you on course for your journey.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, I have done a lot of work. I did go through 2 opiate addictions during my career, and I'm coming up on 5 years clean, and it's going to rehab at 25 really really changed everything for me, because when you're in this insular hockey world, there's only really one thing that matters, and it's that hockey community, and it's winning at all costs. And so then I found mindfulness practices, I found meditation, I found yoga, I found, you know, eating organically, and started learning all these new words like gluten, you know, 10 years ago. You know? So yeah, there's, and then, you know, started doing EMDR therapy and talk therapy, and like started creating that relationship with myself. But I mean, it still definitely wasn't a healthy relationship, because I was still in that career. And I could look back on my career, and there are good things that happen, right? I met my wife, and I've got a lot of friends through that hockey, and I definitely earned every inch that I got. But there was a lot of trauma. You know, there was a lot of trauma, physical and emotional, and I could see that I was suffering from anxiety and depression now that I look back on my career. You know, it's kind of undiagnosed. And so I think with somebody like me, who's kind of an extreme case, I needed something to get me out of it, you know, and the experience is one thing. I always say this, that's just a tool that can be used responsibly, or it can be abused. And then there's the work afterwards, right?
Absolutely.
Integrating what you actually see in that experience, in the peak experience, which, you know, how I correlated it through my experience was, you know, I definitely was lost. But I know that if this guy that his hand on my shoulder, that if I start creating these closer relationships, that I'll start feeling better, and then I could start trusting people. And it really just changed my whole perspective, because I'm used to fighting all the time and being on edge, and really there's no recovery when your cortisol levels are 3 times as high, like what my blood work showed. And so I think, you know, coming back from that, and then you know, really implementing the lessons learned into my life, cherishing it, and then waking up every morning and doing an assessment, right? I still do this stuff from when I was 25, about just a quick scan. It doesn't need to, you don't need to sit up straight, and you know, you just do your thing, and you breathe into it. And if you're feeling off, if I'm feeling off, usually a gratitude list helps in the morning. And then before I assess, I take my supplements that I've used, and then I hydrate, and then I go into my day, you know, and so there's definitely, you know, there's a lot more to it than definitely just taking one of these medicines. And I have a really great support team, and I communicate often with my shaman, and I, you know, still learning, you know, every day. Yeah. Just trying to get better.
That integration process is a lifelong journey in some sense. There is no expectation to arrive at some destination or some finish line. And it seems like there's been some very critical experiences along the way that have helped you shift your perspective, both insofar as how you see yourself and others. It sounds like, at least in that previous life, although it's not entirely gone from you, there's obviously a way to think about that without it necessarily being solely about the consequences of kind of what's how it's impacted you. It sounded like certain values were being reinforced. Right? You were a fighter. You had a reputation for the kind of being in a certain kind of role, and it seemed like, in some sense, it didn't really fully allow you to be yourself in the fullest of senses. And an injury, it sounds like, as it's the case with many of the clients I work with as well, can be devastating, and also provide an opportunity of pause to consider, wait a minute, what have I been up to? And am I acting in a manner consistent with what's most important to me? It sounds like you had a bit of that revelation, and there were many others that kind of helped support you through that. Yeah,
I mean, that's, you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, when I was 25, I had, so I mean, I could list off the the injuries that you read. It was 2 horizontal tears in both ankles, no PCL in my right knee. I've done my MCL 5 times on my right knee. Arthritis in both knees, had an ACL reconstructive surgery on my left knee, done my MCL 4 times on my left knee. I've had an arthroscopic hip surgery on my left hip, arthritis in both hips. Wow. Had my abdomen stapled back to my pelvis. I have no left labrum in my shoulder, and numerous neck tears, 3 lost teeth, if you can't tell, and broken nose. Yeah. And then 7 documented concussions, you know, and those injuries alone are really difficult and a lonely time get through, you know, but you lean on people, and you know, to be honest, I was just so like used to being alone, you know, like there's so much alone time when you're in hockey, and isolation, and it's, you know, I was dependent on substances, you know, throughout my career, and you know, it was, you know, there were times in my career where I was really healthy, and there were times when I wasn't, but all of those injuries that I listed out, I had those all before 25. So to your point, I mean, that's before I started living the right way and started like looking back, like, wait a minute, you know, should I have had 90% of these injuries by the time I'm 25, and things aren't really going that well. And if your life is unmanageable, well, then you need to assess it. And so I did. And that's when I asked for help at 25. And I think that's the biggest thing is just asking for help. And then that's when I turned everything around. You know, I had tons of injuries, didn't have much success, made the playoffs a couple times. And then my last 5 years in the league, when I implemented the mindfulness practices and treating people the right way, I went to the Stanley Cup finals 4 times with 3 different teams. And, you know, it's like your luck it's a sure thing, you know, if you're living the right way, and things start to happen as you know, with these plants, with this network of whatever you may call it. It really helps you stay in your intuition, you know, and that's how I was kind of living my last 5 years in the league.
It's wonderful. You also made an allusion to yourself as being more inclined towards self-love after some of these experiences, which to me seems like a very important catalyst to treating yourself well. I mean, it's hard to do well by yourself if you're not kind to yourself, or certainly even to let other people in and support you along the journey if you're not feeling that self-love. I wonder to what extent you think that has to do with the medicines that you encountered specifically, or if that was kind of was there a broader context to consider there as well?
Yeah, I think the self-love just comes from just the living since 4 years old in a hockey rink, you know, getting yelled at, you know, and just really, I mean, that sport's dangerous, you know, and it's me or you, and that's the mentality you have to have. And I was just really good at it being me, you know, and but to a fault, you know, and I don't regret anything. I do it all the same. With the information that I had. It's just now that I know more, and I definitely have remorse. And so, yeah, it's definitely, it's a new way of living, you know, where you don't have to fight everything. And it's I do still work with my hands, and it's much more peaceful, you know? And so I'm grateful for what these medicines did. And I mean, I was so negative towards myself, you know, and now I'm not. And I think the biggest thing that happened is, you know, you start loving yourself. I started loving my kids more, started loving my wife more. I started loving every present moment more. And I mean, I have to say it's been the best year of my life, you know, and I've won Stanley Cups, and you can take that for what it's worth. I mean, I was just so dead inside when I did that, you know, and so, yeah, man, this is by far been the best year of my life.
Yeah. It really challenges a lot of assumptions that we have. Certainly myself, growing up a kid in Toronto, I mean, my aspirations were to join you on the ice at some point, but I missed the mark on so many counts, but that's for my own work, if you will. Yeah. But to share your story in light of the fact that it's easy for us to look at you thinking that, my goodness, like you've hit pinnacles, right? You've had your own peak experiences separate from the ones that you might have otherwise associated with a psychedelic medicine or a molecule that you've ingested. And yet you can acknowledge that even amidst those experiences, there was kind of a deadening. It wasn't connecting with you in the ways that now you're celebrating, and in some sense you see as a blessing. There's so much I can say, and I almost realize that I should probably check in to see. There's a lot of questions coming in from the chat here. Let's see where we are with things. But I appreciate you being so open.
Of course, yeah. And I have, you know, if I drop out, I'll call back in because my computer's getting a little low. So Just giving you a heads up.
So
Thanks.
I was just going to recommend that we actually wrap up. I think, you know, your Daniel's story is so inspirational and inspiring. I think it's a great way to finish. I know there's a lot of questions in the chat. I'll hang out back here and answer some questions. And we are very much available to everybody who's taken part tonight. You can just email us at hi@fieldtriphealth.com and we'll connect you with the right people in our organization to get any answers to your questions. But yeah, I don't want to take away from that ending, that very inspirational story. I want people to leave with that and take that into their evening and hopefully their tomorrow morning. Because I'm going to, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Very
Thanks,
inspiring.
brother. Yeah, appreciate that, man. Great questions. I feel like I feel like I just got treatment. You know, it was great.
The feeling is mutual. The feeling is mutual. It's, you know, we are definitely in this together, right? So
For sure.
just telling your story itself promotes healing, because I do believe that we heal as a community, right? So you're broadening the community, challenging some of our assumptions, and also paving the way. So
yeah, thank you, man. Yeah, there's what they say? Someone said to me, I heard it somewhere, I'm not taking credit for it. You heal yourself, you could heal your family, you could heal your community. You know, so yeah, hopefully people take advantage of this for sure. So thank you guys, appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you everybody for joining us. Really appreciate it. Take care.